Today I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Sue Carter, who's my postdoc advisor here visiting. She is a research professor of psychology at Northeastern University and an adjunct professor of psychiatry at the University of North Carolina, but also professor emerita of psychiatry at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and she formerly held the position of Distinguished University Professor of Biology at the University of Maryland. She is the past president of the International Behavioral Neuroscience Society, holds fellow status in that society and in the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She's authored over 275 publications, including editorship of 5 books, the most recent of which is Attachment and Bonding, a New Synthesis from MIT Press. Dr. Carter's research has documented the role of oxytocin and vasopressin in social bond formation, and her most recent work focuses on the developmental consequences of oxytocin, including perinatal exposure to synthetic oxytocin and the protective role of this peptide in the regulation of behavioral and autonomic reactivity to stressful experience. So we're very happy to have Sue here at Davis today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Karen. Obviously, someone who can't keep a job. Well, that's a long story. So it's so wonderful, really, really wonderful to be here because I know people all the way back till some of them were 1 week old. But anyway, that's another long story. I'm going to tell a little bit different tale than the one I originally titled. So as a couple of the people in the room know, I've been rethinking everything about what I think I know about hormones and behavior in the last couple of months. So bear with me if it's a little disjointed. It's because I've put in things that weren't supposed to be there, but we'll see. Anyway, it's a total pleasure to be here. I've had some extremely, extremely stimulating conversations. Randi Hagerman is sitting on the front row, and David Steinhorn in the back we're setting up a program. They're going to do all the work to save people from pains and dying. So that's good enough for today, right? Anyway, so let's go. I always like to start by thanking the most important people in my life. My husband, Steve Porges, who really did stimulate my interest in this topic that I'm going to talk about, and my 2 sons, Seth on the left, Eric on the right, who have really forced me to study this whole area of love, attachment, hormones, especially the older one, Eric, because I was given the hormone oxytocin when he was born. That's really the day. So that was July 27th, 1980. That's really the day I started studying this subject. But it's getting more interesting all the time. This is not a slide I made up for here. I always have Karen's name first on my list of collaborators because she was my postdoctoral fellow for a couple of years, 4 or 5, whatever. And I had Angela Grippo, Jason Yee, Bill Kinkle, Hussein Nazarlou, whose new data I'm showing. There could be a list, of course, pages of wonderful people. The questions I want to ask are listed here. There are things like, what is love? What are social bonds? What are the causes and consequences of these things? And what do people mean by love? And there is a little backstory about the love talk. I didn't mean to study love. I never meant to study it. I was accused of studying it in a review of a grant. I got this in what they used to call the pink sheets, and it wasn't a compliment. And it was something written about work that I was involved with, calling oxytocin the hormone of love. And it's become a bit of a question, and so I'll address that. I'm going to talk about oxytocin, a very ancient hormone, one that really does play a role, at least in social bonds, social support, healing, and restoration. And I'm going to add a little twist to this about a sort of, I don't know if I'd call it a theory, but a notion I have that maybe we wouldn't be here today and wouldn't have the brains we have, the kind of nervous system we have, or the sociality we have if oxytocin didn't exist. So, of course, there are components to what we call love, social engagement, which can occur at all ages, not restricted to adults. You can fall in love. It's a wonderful thing, and it does require a functional engagement system, but it's staying in love, it's staying together, it's having long-term relationships that really matter, and these require social bonds. And we can talk, if we have time at the end, about what that means. There are, I'm asking the question, are there common elements in the neurobiology of social engagement and of lasting bonds or relationships? And the answer is yes. But let's step back from this a bit and say, how did we get this way? Well, most living organisms, even bacteria, survive better, reproduce better. Even asexual organisms do better when there are others around. But the mammalian nervous system is probably a kind of extreme example and functions best in a social environment. Social behavior is necessary for physiological and behavioral homeostasis. Myron Hofer, some years ago, called this hidden regulators. And I think that really exists. And maybe we're going to figure out what those hidden regulators are. Now, we know for sure that they exist by their absence. If you don't have social bonds, if you feel isolated, what happens? People start to substitute. They substitute drugs, food, and they may even have mental dysfunctions. In the absence of love or self-induced isolation, sometimes you even get to deep forms of depression, illness, shutdown disorders, even death. So then, again, what's love? Well, and what are the mechanisms through which loving relationships form? I argue, and I'm not sure I'm right, that possibly the prototype for this is the parent-child bond. But you also see bonds, of course, between two adults. Love is not limited to humans. Social attachment is actually a common feature of most definitions of love. And the need for these social bonds and the social support is what's really not limited. So the problem with studying love, which again, remember, I didn't set out to do, is that it's an abstract construct. And I'm really an animal behavior researcher, and animals don't have abstract concepts, but they do have social bonds. And when I discovered that, and I first realized that in the late 1970s, working with an animal we'll talk about later, the prairie vole, I realized that if so many similarities could be occurring between human behavior, parallels, whether they're homology or analogies, I don't know, but it wasn't likely that these were accidental. These were really important things. And of course, there are two basic functions that we worry about: survival and reproduction. Survival includes social support, constructs like safety. Reproduction, of course, you need access to mates, you have to take care of your babies, and your body presumably is seeking a genetic survival. So survival's the first law of nature. It used to be. Is it still the first law of nature? It's biologically important that we are not alone. Sociality has survival benefits. There's safety in numbers. Having a few extra eyes is useful. But there's more to it than that. We've got to have a nervous system that brings us together. And the hormone oxytocin, studying that has given us a deeper understanding of several, I would say, rather big issues: the evolution of human behavior, the power of love and support, why humans are so dependent on sociality. Why is it that we get so messed up when our social behaviors aren't the way we want them to be? And then what are the mechanisms through which giving and receiving love heals? And it really does. And it probably is better to give than receive if you have a choice. Somebody actually did an experiment on this. So trying to untangle this, you can see I've been working for years with this criticism of me that I was studying love. And I said, well, what is love? Okay, I don't know exactly what that is. Is it social bonds? And if I don't know what it is, I could at least ask, when does it happen? Well, it happens at pregnancy, at birth, when the mother, the father, others in the family, others who may not be in the family, as Sarah Hrdy says, mothers and others are really important to allowing these kinds of sociality to exist, and it's built on something we call an attachment. And there are people in this room like Bill Mason, Ross Thompson, who know a lot more about attachment than I do in the way humans talk about it. but it's important. We can all agree on that. We may not know exactly what it is, but it's associated first with birth, with lactation, with something that we call love or even sexual behavior. And social bonds also can form, and these are some of the more interesting ones in a way, when something bad happens, when there's adversity. If this room started to shake, if we had an earthquake, or back where I lived in Illinois, a nice tornado came through, we would all be friendly. And actually there are studies after 9/11, I just learned about these, for about 6 months, people were nicer. Then it kind of went away. But in the face of adversity, and when there's a need for other, that's when we really come around to our social needs. And so we ask again, well, what's love? What is the evidence that social bonds are critical? And in this case, I do want to talk about the healing power of love, because the healing power of love is really the healing power of the human body to heal itself. And when we understand that, a lot of what we call medicine will not be necessary. We'll have new tools. So again, I've argued that the evolutionary prototype is this parent-child interaction, and I think pictures say more than I can say. They really make this point very strongly. Even a generally less than social mammals, like the orangutan, shows high levels of social behavior with their offspring. This mother-infant interaction is so powerful that most people, when they see pictures of this, they have actually sensations, positive experiences themselves. The kitty is particularly loving. Of course, parenting is not limited to the mother. We know this very well. It's not limited to biological offspring, unless this is Mr. Obama's love child. We can't be 100% sure, but I think we can. Not everyone's prepared to be a parent. Some of us may need help, okay? Even among women, not everyone's prepared to be a parent. There are differences, the kind of tightly wrapped mom on the right and the earth mother on the left. So how do we get at this? Well, my approach has always been kind of a mechanistic behavioral endocrine approach. And so what I've tried to do throughout the last 30-odd years is to look at a biological basis of behaviors and see if I can use that to sort of backward understand what they are, what these things we're talking about are. And over that 30-odd years, there have been a whole string of studies in rodents that leave no doubt that the mechanisms underlying social bonds share the neuroendocrine substrates for sex, birth, maternal behavior, lactation, sociality more generally, and they all seem to have, all arrows have over time pointed at oxytocin. I wouldn't have believed this 30 years ago. It certainly isn't my doing, but now oxytocin's hot. Okay, finally. I was telling someone today I was interested in this way so far back, and I was explaining to one of my friends who was a program officer at NIH how I thought this was really important, and he was actually a chemist. He was going to help me measure it, and he just laughed. He literally laughed at me. He said, "No one is going to be interested in this." So I wish I'd gotten that quote, you know what I mean? Because it's kind of fun to be right once in a while. Mostly I'm not right, so it was a good experience. So by taking the lactating woman, the first model I used that was really direct was really lactating women, and I had nursed those babies. They aren't exactly babies, but I had tried to provide them with human milk, mainly out of paranoia that there was something in those other things that were being given to babies that might not be good for them. I mean, who knew, who could believe that a drug company, and the formulas are all made by pharma, would be better for you than the biologically original compound, and I'm still pretty sure that's true. But I thought, well, maybe if no one really cares about babies, and I'd begun to be a little cynical about this, I'm thinking, well, because otherwise everyone would breastfeed their baby if they could. Maybe if I convince them that it's the mother who's benefiting, they might come around and say, well, okay, I'll try this, you know, if it's going to do something for me. So I think that's terribly cynical. I don't quite view it that way anymore. But I began to sort of see, well, maybe I could use those lactating women as a kind of model and compare them to non-lactating women. And in that way, I began to study oxytocin indirectly. So let me show you oxytocin before we move on. This is the molecule. It's quite simple. 9 amino acids, has a ring and a tail. It's been studied quite a bit lately. And this sort of model, as I've said, was the breastfeeding mother. Now, historically, if you didn't breastfeed your baby, somebody else had to, because the other animal substitutes, to my knowledge, were never quite good enough. And so the women were nursing. In this particular picture, you can't see too well, this is a mistress of Henri IV, I think, and the wet nurse is in the background, holding her baby. And there are various versions, by the way, of this picture. Sometimes the wet nurse looks very angry. Sometimes she seems very sweet-natured. I don't know if they were all painted by different people. But the woman herself was very proud of her childlike body. She had multiple children. I think she had, you know, Sarah, 5 at least. So she wanted to look like a girl, and she had herself painted nude so everyone would see that her breasts were small and very compact and hadn't been used by all those babies. But it was her brain I was interested in, okay? What had she done? What happened to her brain as a result of not feeding her baby? Now, oxytocin is the one function that's unequivocally related to oxytocin is lactation. It's actually a milk ejection component of lactation. And it's also important to birth, but actually in mice, animals made mutant for the oxytocin gene can still give birth. So it's not essential. It may be that birth is part of an old and multiply redundant system that actually came out of egg laying, who knows. But anyway, breastfeeding, pretty good way to think about differences in two populations. And I started a study with a collaborator, Marty Altimus, who was then, we were both working at NIH. And Marty is a psychiatrist, and she had worked with lactating women who were, her specialty was OCD, obsessive compulsive disorders. And when these women were lactating, or pregnant actually, late pregnancy, their OCD would go into remission. And these are people who are like washing their hands 5,000 times an hour. I mean, they were pretty serious. They didn't get all the way to her unless they were quite sick. So she was kind of taken by this herself. She hadn't even had kids at that point. But we began to do this study. And I'm going to talk more about this, but basically oxytocin then is really important to human evolution. I'm going to make this point again later. And part of the problem is that our heads are so big. I want to come back to this. We have a very big cranium, which we've stuffed with cortex. Okay, we got some brainstem in there, you'll see in a minute. We also have an extended period of dependency on others. More extended, I'm not sure how many, I'm not an expert on comparative reproduction. There probably are some species in which there are longer periods of dependency, but we're way out there. We're it. Sarah says we're it. Okay. So mothers and others, somebody's got to take care of that baby. Something has to keep us together, okay? This model then, this lactating model, became one that I could use in my own head to think about oxytocin, to study women who had given birth but were or were not nursing. And we did a whole string of experiments. This talk, by the way, for anyone who's data bound, you can leave now and I won't notice because I'm skipping most of the data that support this, but there's lots and lots of it. And what we found out first, and others began to see at the same time, was that lactation had effects not just on the mother's brain, but also on the HPA, or the hypothalamic pituitary axis, the stress axis. So there were two targets that were emerging in the literature at that time. And I'll show you why they're targets. But let me just show you just a tiny little bit of data. Things like heart rate in the bottle feeding versus the breastfeeding woman, or a control. This was a woman who hadn't given birth but was in the follicular phase. And you see that the women who gave birth and then bottle fed their babies had a little bit higher heart rate. It's not real high, but these are all young, healthy people, and it should have been back down around 70. They had higher blood pressure. Again, not high blood pressure, but higher than average for the age group comparison. And if they were given a physical stressor, in this case, or other kinds of stressors have been used now since, where they were put on a treadmill, we had them running very hard. The women who were bottle feeding reacted more. Their baseline cortisol, which is kind of a nice index for this study, and this is ACTH, I'm sorry, I took the cortisol, it looks the same, the data look the same. ACTH, in this case, was about here. It wasn't really different before the stressor. After the stressor, the women who were breastfeeding showed a very slight increase. The women who were bottle feeding, much more significant change. We saw that in vasopressin, we saw it in cortisol, same exact kind of data. Here's vasopressin, another of the, we'll talk about vasopressin later, it's a stress hormone. We even saw differences in the immune system. This is a study done by Laura Redwine, who was a postdoc with me at the time, and what she did was look at proliferation of lymphocytes in breastfeeding versus bottle feeding women. And we had the stress. The stress didn't really matter in this case, but the breastfeeding women had a more active, apparently more active immune system. So what I think goes on, I think what lactation does is it allows women to manage stress more effectively. They're less reactive, or perhaps more appropriately reactive. It's not good to turn off the HP axis. That's not the goal. The goal is to know when to respond, for the body to respond appropriately. And I think that what lactation really is a kind of buffer, a physiological buffer between the state of pregnancy, which is incredibly complicated. If someone came from another planet and you told them how mammals, especially humans, reproduce, they probably wouldn't believe you because it's so complex and stressful. But it happens, usually works pretty well. And oxytocin's a big piece of that transition that the woman goes through. And as I've said, was probably, if I use the word design inappropriately, you'll understand, but it's in place in a way that allowed us to take care of our babies efficiently. So here's a molecule again, oxytocin. It was first thought to be a female reproductive hormone. That was bad news, okay? That put oxytocin on the research sidelines for decades. Because if something was only important to females, and especially reproductive females, who cared? We're already too productive in terms of number of babies. And so it really didn't get attention until it got an identity and for other kinds of functions. But it was very well known. By 1906, people knew that oxytocin could act on the uterus and the mammary glands, or at least they knew that something that came out of the pituitary gland, if you ground it up, you could milk eject, and it could stimulate birth. That, of course, is only part of the story. Then it became apparent over the last 20 years, really, that what was happening, oxytocin wasn't just coming out through the pituitary, it was actually going out into the brains. It was coming out of the soma, out of the dendrites, the axons. It was flowing through the nervous system. There's a concept called volume transmission that's kind of a arguable construct in neuroscience, but there are new papers now that suggest there are actually expressways in the brain where oxytocin flows from where it's made in the middle of the brain off to the side to the amygdala. Oxytocin, we now know, can affect social behavior, can affect the autonomic nervous system, the immune system. It allows the body to adapt and protect in the face of challenge. It's part of the reason we are such a successfully reproductive species. And it is central to all of those things that I mentioned before, but it's also, I'm going to argue today, it's central to the evolution of the human nervous system and to evolution of human behavior. So before we go on with that, we need to take a quick look at sort of what brains look like. And this slide from the internet, it just shows you relative sizes of brain tissue, and in this case, especially cortex in humans, chimps, rhesus. The rat's so small it's not even worth discussing. And crocodiles, who have a fairly good-sized brain, but very little cortex. And other species, of course. So you have invertebrates already a molecule that's sort of like oxytocin. I'll show you this in a minute. You actually see it before we get to the vertebrate-invertebrate split. But it's oxytocin itself that's special. So what I'm suggesting today is that the human nervous system, and this is really simple-minded, but as far as I can tell, people haven't thought about it too much, First, we know that the human nervous system is a consequence of evolution. We have a massive increase in the cerebral cortex. And that someplace in the transition from reptiles to mammals, we added the version of oxytocin that we have now, the specific molecule we call oxytocin. And that this begins to permit certain obvious things to happen. Everyone in the room can measure their own head or feel it if you like, and you're going to see it's really big. And it was really big when you were born and when your ancestors were born, before there was were the kinds of interventions that are used like C-sections. That head, my son's head was 14 inches around, okay? That head had to get from the outside through the cervix, which is just this big before you start giving birth. And even if you get to what they call 10 centimeters in obstetrics, a fully dilated cervix, that's not enough room to get the baby out. The only way the baby can get out is with a powerful muscle contractant, and that's oxytocin. So only because we had that could we get that big brain. But then we had to do some other things. Our ancestral evolutionary ancestors had to make sure that we not only gave birth to the baby, but since we didn't want it to be too big, and there's this war between the sexes over how big the baby should be or should not be, the mother favors small babies, according to the theory, the Haig's theory. Some women in the audience are saying, yes, small babies, very good. But you have to, no matter how big that baby is, it needs something to eat. Mammals are mammals by definition, by the fact that they lactate and feed their babies. And in the case of our own species, at least, and we can discuss this with Sally Mendoza, Bill Mason, or some of the people who really know about it, they're really not, you know, every species has some way, by sort of definition, of keeping and supporting whatever they produce, especially in mammals. And what we've done then, in addition to getting a big brain, we also had to supply that huge cortex with extra oxygen. And that extra oxygen actually comes through the autonomic nervous system, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute or two. And that's also oxytocin-regulated process. Now, if you don't believe me that we're poorly designed, here's a nice picture from the internet, from the Encyclopedia Britannica, showing the human pelvis and a human head. And you can see it's not looking good. And a nice gorilla pelvis in this sort of slickly designed, aerodynamic designed skull. So these guys, obviously, if everything were equal, would probably have a little bit easier time getting their babies to the outside. Now, humans are really in trouble. Oh, I forgot to mention, very important, it's because we were standing upright that things really got bad. We had to get a fixed pelvis to put to attach our legs to, so we could locomote and do all of the sort of amazing things that we do. So the strong uterine contractions that oxytocin allows are really important. Oxytocin does not act alone. It has a genetic sibling known as vasopressin. Vasopressin only differs from oxytocin by 2 amino acids. Those 2 amino acids do have an effect, but the hormones are enough alike that they can talk to each other's receptors. And this creates a lot of complexity for people trying to do research, but it's also very adaptive. So here's a picture from Zoe Donaldson and Larry Young, a very nice science article on the evolution of oxytocin. And I just want you to see that here at the split, the way they've drawn it between invertebrates and vertebrates, we already, before that split, there was in place a gene or genes that were producing something like oxytocin. So this is not a modern molecule. It didn't just evolve with humans. It's just that the version we have in primates, and mammals in general, except for the placental mammals, have vasopressin and oxytocin in these forms. There's some variants that are found in pigs and also in marsupials. But you see, basically something happened in evolution. We got this interesting form of the molecule. And maybe we took it to the extreme. One possibility is that the the differences, these two amino acid differences between oxytocin and vasopressin gave them enough differences in function that they started to do some of the things that they do. I know that's vague, but we don't really understand what's going on. But what we do know is that our the ancestor of mammals probably was a turtle. That's the last I heard. Somebody can correct me. A species that didn't have a lot of defensive problems because it would just kind of draw back in its shell. But then we got rid of that tortoise protection. We needed each other. We started to need sociality in a kind of an extreme way. Social behavior, social engagement. And in addition, we still needed the ability to defend ourselves. So we created, our evolutionary history created a kind of yin-yang dance between two very important hormones, oxytocin and vasopressin. Now, they started as one gene, as far as we know, and actually vasopressin is more like the primitive version of this. Vasopressin is mainly, probably its original functions were water retention. They were allowing us to live on dry land or to even return to a salty sea. Vasopressin has been studied rather extensively, and I'm just listing up there some of the things that it seems to do. It's involved in territoriality. This is really when I got interested in it. I saw work by Craig Ferris, who's now at Northeastern University, and he showed that hamsters, given a little extra vasopressin, would go around the room and do a defensive marking about 5,000 times an hour. Like those washing women, as fast, that's like as fast as you could do it. It's interesting, the same numbers. But I didn't make that up. So they would go around the cage and mark and mark and mark if they got extra vasopressin. Oxytocin, very different phenotype, behavioral phenotype, more of a social phenotype, sharing behaviors. Vasopressin's associated with vigilance and mobilization. It's very good. Vasopressin's released by salt, so if any of you have trouble staying awake, if you happen to be a truck driver, you can go to any truck stop and get all the salt you want on these little seeds. And that's been obviously discovered by people driving trucks. It keeps them awake. This is probably the most useful thing I'm going to say. If you have insomnia, you might want to look and see how much salt there is in your diet. You may be creating your own hypervigilance. Vasopressin is associated with active behaviors, mobilization, oxytocin with passive behaviors, relaxation, what my husband actually has called immobilization without fear. So there are different kinds of immobilization, but the one in which you're social, when you allow others near you, that's what Steve calls immobilization without fear. Both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are affected by oxytocin and vasopressin. The split that I've put up there is artificial, but sympathetic processes are probably a bit more driven by vasopressin, parasympathetic, oxytocin, and remember I mentioned earlier, very likely one of the most important things that oxytocin does is it allows us to create a special oxygenation of the brain and of the cortex. And if you don't believe that's important, then just look at or think about what happens when people lose the blood supply to their brain. They don't die immediately, they just become unconscious. They cannot think. So cognition depends on this autonomic nervous system and on it supplying sufficient blood for this huge, massive, it's the most oxygen-hungry tissue in the body, I think. Maybe the liver competes, but it's a very oxygen-needy tissue, and that special parasympathetic nervous system, which is also implicated in cognition and all kinds of functions, is necessary. So back to my original questions. What's love? What's oxytocin? Well, I've tried over and over again to make this simpler and simpler, and I've come to the conclusion that one of the things it is that the kind of oxytocin's presence is a kind of physiological metaphor for safety, probably acting through the autonomic nervous system. Now, you have to understand that the autonomic nervous system is called that because you can't sense it. And most people cannot sense oxytocin. They don't know whether they do or don't have it. If you give it to them as a treatment, they can't tell you. It doesn't create a high. It's not a euphoria, but there is something special about the state into which people move with a little extra oxytocin. The effects of these often differ in males and females, and I won't have time to talk about that. And they're also this system, the oxytocin system, another thing I can't talk about today, is it looks like it's a system that's epigenetically regulated in early life. And it may be very, very important that that system can kind of be tuned, possibly by the mother, by the way the mother treats the baby. Michael Meany has made a career out of showing that different amounts of licking and grooming may matter to babies, whether or not they grow up to be sort of calm or mobilized. These can create actual methylation events that are truly epigenetic. So it's a very exciting construct, and we're working, both Karen and I are working with a wonderful woman from the University of Virginia, Jess Connolly, who's actually studying the methylation of the oxytocin receptor and has quantified this, and we can kind of go through and use this as a kind of dependent variable that starts to predict, and it does seem to predict some of the maternal behavior, some of the outcomes. So the body is a way of tuning that system. I think that what we're learning from the study of the causes and the consequences of sociality, of the social nervous system, is really giving us a whole new look, a new way of thinking about human emotion and natural factors such as social support and love, which statistically contribute more than anything except genes to outcome. Whether you smoke or not, what you eat is less important than how you feel, whether you feel supported. That's bigger in terms of epidemiological studies, so it's quite amazing. And oxytocin being at the center of this, and part of this very complex system, of course I'm only talking about one small element of a very complex system, helps though to explain, I think by using it as almost a lens or a metaphor, as I've said, you can start to see things that we might not have seen otherwise, including why constructs like love heal us. And I'll just give you some examples in a minute. But my basic argument here is that oxytocin facilitates social engagement, senses of safety, love, empathy, compassion, relaxation. All of these have been studied. And vasopressin, probably somewhat the opposite, more of a defense. Now, this is not bad. This is adaptive. If something bad happens, you don't want to be just sitting there all sort of blissed out. You want to get out of there. You want to be able to get away from danger. You want to have adaptive responses. And vasopressin, being able to go right to the oxytocin receptor and alter its functions and go to its own receptor, which then is probably mobilizing, has a tremendous power as a tool. So love does heal, and there's quite a lot of evidence for this I won't have time to go through, but I'll just give you some examples. It's been shown that oxytocin can heal injured burns, making the burn half as big in rat models. Heart disease, actually oxytocin seems to be able to reprogram undifferentiated stem cells and cause them to go to change form, become cardiomyocytes. There's a wonderful group at the University of Montreal studying this. Bones, osteoporosis. Oxytocin is low in human osteoporosis, and in a rat model, it actually protected against the loss of calcium. Intestinal bowel diseases, stroke. One of my former students, Courtney DeVries, did this amazing stroke model. The size of the stroke was half as big if the animals were either living socially or had oxytocin. And of course, I've made most of my living for the last decade or so in psychiatry. Diseases like anxiety, depression, autism, schizophrenia, all of those have an oxytocin component. And people are using oxytocin therapeutically in these disorders with some degree of success. Oxytocin's anti-inflammatory, and it's an antioxidant. My gut feeling is that that's going to be one of the most important things it does. And there are many other anti-inflammatories and antioxidants, and how these all interact, I don't think we know. but it's very important. We did a study, I'll just give you an example so you won't think I just make up this stuff. I did a study with Jean-Philippe Goyen and Janice Kikolt-Glaser at Ohio State a few years ago. And what we did was just measure oxytocin in people who had been given little biopsy-like wounds on their arm. The speed of healing was different in the people with the higher oxytocin. Their wounds healed faster. So we're back to kind of this evolutionary picture. And I want to make one more point. The oxytocin effects are on really old, primitive parts of the nervous system. The way the brain is made is kind of peculiar in a way, and we've forgotten, most of us, especially scientists, forgotten. We got to thinking our cortex was really good for something and very, very important and was running everything. But the reality is that most of the most vital functions in the body come from up, from bottom up. And they start in the brainstem, in the autonomic nervous system. And that's where oxytocin is especially powerful. In rats, by the time a rat is an adult, there are very few oxytocin receptors in the cortex. But the rest of the brain, the amygdala and points below that, are very sensitive to oxytocin throughout life. The take-home message on this slide is that if someone tells you don't have a drug addiction, don't have bulimia, don't have anxiety, you can tell them to go away, please, and leave you alone, because you cannot tell your nervous system that those things are bad. You have to kind of be clever, or you have to outsmart yourself and get into different environments in which you don't feel threatened. And the old nervous system that's there trying to protect you and keep you mobilized doesn't act up. And now the cortex is useful, don't misunderstand me. It has some functions. But it cannot, because it was put on last. So if you think of this as the brainstem and the cortex here, it was put on last. The cortex was put on last. In rats, we did studies years ago with decorticate rats with a group in Canada, and you could pull off the entire cortex. The animals looked pretty normal, except they were more social, not less, than the animals that weren't decorticated. These were neonatal decorticates with Brian Kolb and Ian Wishaw. So at the time, I didn't know what to make of that. So, oh my God, what is the cortex for? I still don't know. I think it's for speech. I think it might be for speech. Anyway, here's a brain, just a section of a brain showing you of a prairie vole, actually. We're not going to have too much time to talk about these stories. But there are all those cells that are in black, and all of these fibers are oxytocin-labeled cells. It's a massive amount of labeling. And actually, someone years ago did Floyd Bloom's group at Scripps did a study in which they looked using PCR actually mRNA. It was a different method. It was 1996. They used a method for measuring the most abundant gene expression, and oxytocin was number one. And at the time, people ignored that. They said, well, that's just that female hormone. What could it be doing? What could it be good for? Well, we now know, and I don't have the liberty to show you the data yet, but the amount of oxytocin in human blood is about 1,000 times higher than we thought. And that's when I saw those data, which was in the last year, I said, oh, wait a minute. Because even I had been thinking, well, this is just a modulator. It's not like running things. But I think it really may be important, believe it or not. And it's coming out of this part of the brain called the paraventricular nucleus, which is the convergence. It's the integrative command post for the nervous system. And it sits right in the old hypothalamus, and there are inputs in and out of that to all over the important parts of the brain. There's the Ralph-A nucleus, solitary tract of the nucleus tractus solitarius, locus coeruleus. Any of you who are into neuroanatomy know these are big points for making monoamines, norepinephrine, serotonin, and so forth. And it just goes all over the place, that paraventricular input. And it's bathed in oxytocin. I probably won't go through this. We're kind of running out of time. But I want you to know that oxytocin, the old model you learned of the stress response, that was probably not quite complete because of oxytocin sitting there in the paraventricular nucleus. It's allowing us to respond to stress according to context, according to whether or not it's safe or not to use the different kinds of stress responses we have. So oxytocin, I think, is a kind of metaphor for safety. Endogenous oxytocin is probably not sufficient in some people, but I'm not advocating giving oxytocin myself. I'm very nervous about the fact, especially to healthy people. It's being given to autistic children as we speak. My husband was on a plane last week, and the woman next to him had an autistic child, and she was buying it off the internet and spraying it into the child. God knows what she was really giving. Who knows? And it's not a controlled substance, and there's probably a lot of like cornstarch and stuff out there. But it's playing. Oxytocin is more than a female hormone. In both sexes, it can regulate stress responses. Its chronic effects are mostly to downregulate stress reactivity. It's regulating the the parasympathetic nervous system and cardiovascular function. It has this anti-inflammatory wound healing effects. It's protecting probably against anxiety and depression and vulnerabilities to disorders like schizophrenia, possibly autism. And it's allowing us to form the social bonds we need in order to have behaviors such as social monogamy. Again, I think I'm going to not have time to tell you the prairie vole story, which is fine, because you can hear it from Karen anytime you're interested. But we have, over the years, developed this model called I didn't call it the prairie vole, which happens to be a socially monogamous species. It's rather rare to have this kind of social system. And this little animal, which we were able to study in nature and in the laboratory, it was possible to show that oxytocin in that model played a role in pair bonding. And that was my first sort of epiphany. I said, oh, this is really amazing. These animals are not learning social bonds in the way that I thought. There is a learning component, but it's not the kind of instrumental learning probably that I thought was going on. Of course, Kurt Peterson had already showed a role for oxytocin in maternal behavior in 1979. We've seen effects on paternal behavior, which I won't go through today. I was going to show you some of that. A bit too complicated, I think, for the amount of time we have left. The prairie vole, though, is interesting because I can't prove it yet, but I think they have a bigger brain than they should. They certainly have higher levels of oxytocin, like 4 to 10 times higher than rats. They're in the human range for both oxytocin and this autonomic measure of parasympathetic activity that my husband has spent years studying, the respiratory sinus arrhythmia. Oxytocin is released not just under positive conditions. This has caused a lot of consternation for people who wanted to think it was just this goody two-shoes hormone. It's released when you really need it. Probably the easiest way to get oxytocin to come out is to do bad things, like make animals restrained or give them LPS, an immune challenge. Scientists do this. Chronic isolation in females only, and that I don't totally understand, but that's going to turn out to be important, the sex differences. It's a component of this adaptive coping strategy. It's allowing us to buffer against stresses. I'm not going to show you all of this. You can just look at the pretty pictures. We've done lots of things that prove my points, including that last paper, which I'm not going to tell you about, so you'll have to come ask me later. What I want to do is show you one more feature of oxytocin. It feeds forward. Okay, this is not how most hormones work. Usually if you get a little extra hormone, it feeds back and downregulates. But there's actually a feed forward in oxytocin. This has been known in medicine for a long time, because if you wanted to bring a woman into labor, you could do things like stimulate the cervix or the breast tissue and release a little oxytocin. They now use Pitocin itself rather than using these methods, but this is old knowledge. I'm sure the animal husbandry people knew this a long time. They used to put stones into the uterus of females to cause them to, well, for various reasons. Anyway, when we gave it to animals, we actually got more, not less. And this is good news, because maybe it's good news, but it may also be downregulating its own receptor, and that's a little bit of a wild card here. But if animals are living in pairs or isolated, in this case, at the beginning of the study, they had the same amounts of oxytocin, but if we gave them extra oxytocin, especially if they were paired, then the number of cells, a number of oxytocin cells actually went up, and this is very interesting. Now, what I would like to do to sort of end here and to ask this question, which I'm asked a lot, and I've thought about a lot, and I don't have a simple answer to, is shouldn't oxytocin, it's so wonderful, why don't we just make it into a medicine? And of course, there are plenty of people working on this, so this is not unique. It's already available on the internet because it's not controlled. You can buy this intranasal spray. It has not been evaluated by the FDA. Even the way it's used in medicine, it's really not FDA evaluated. It was grandfathered in because it was out there before the medical applications or the FDA type rules were in place. We have almost no information, exceptions, some studies that Karen's been doing, a few other people are doing now, looking at chronic effects of oxytocin. I think used wisely, it probably does have a role in medicine. Used unwisely, it may, as I've kind of alluded to, downregulate its own receptor. We know it can methylate its receptor, and it may be able to downregulate it. Oxytocin is a component of a very complex neuroendocrine autonomic system. We don't have a deep knowledge of it. It is near impossible to get funding for this kind of work because it's considered basic and old-fashioned and not immediately medically applicable or relevant. But I think that oxytocin actually is a kind of, once we understand it, it's almost like a Rosetta Stone, because embedded in the knowledge of it are knowledge of other healing systems. And I think we should start there, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions for Sue.
Oh, stunned silence. I always love that. Yes, Jackie. That's Jackie Crawley, who just moved to University of California, Davis, and is my old and wonderful friend. No, she's not old. She's my old friend. Friend.
So that was a lovely talk, very fascinating concepts. Would you care to comment on the human imaging studies of trust?
Yeah.
Normal volunteers given oxytocin?
Yeah, it works, but it's a little more complicated. They're discovering, of course. So what they've done is use intranasal oxytocin as a way of delivering this hypothetically to the nervous system. That's the first question. Is it getting to the nervous system? Even if it's not, it's doing something. It seems to work. It works in men. It makes men more trusting. And it also quiets the amygdala in men, at least according to the literature which came out of Germany, so who knows if it's going to extend to another culture, or actually Sweden, Switzerland. But when they gave it to women, it did not quiet the amygdala. It actually increased activation of the amygdala. There haven't been very many behavioral studies. At least the group that started doing this in Switzerland, they couldn't get ethics approval to study women. So they only studied men. It's not a discrimination thing in this case. They just couldn't get permission. They were afraid, these were young people, and they were afraid they might cause us an abortion. So, of course, they could have checked to see if they're pregnant, but anyway. So that was the excuse. So women have been studied only a couple of times, and they may not respond in the same way, but it's been repeated, these studies in men, with this interesting difference in the brain. So I think it works. I think oxytocin probably naturally does, it probably in both sexes, but in different ways, does make us more capable of accepting, trusting others. There's some very nice studies with eye gaze that I think are along the same lines. So people are able, under the influence of oxytocin, again, I think that's all in men though, to look at others in the eyes. It becomes less uncomfortable if you don't know somebody especially. So I guess I buy the findings, but they're all acute, one-time studies. We did some work with this with schizophrenia, giving it to people with schizophrenia, and it's published in 2010 or 11. The extra oxytocin worked best when it was slightly higher dose, and it seemed to make people interpret or allow people to interpret stimuli as less threatening. So quite a bit of evidence kind of looking in that direction. I don't know if I answered your question. I mean, there's a whole cottage industry now of people giving oxytocin to study it. Sarah, and then?
I'd love to hear more about the decorticated, but especially social mice.
Rats.
They grew up?
Yep, they grew up just fine. I know, I said, how can this happen? This was, well,
In their social bonds, or were
they
just...
didn't, well, rats don't really have social bonds, but in general, but these rats were crawling all over each other, extremely indiscriminate. Yeah, what I saw. This is just what I observed. We have data. It was published in 1982.
How old did they get to be?
Well, they were grown up when we got them, and I think they lived pretty well. Kolb and Wishaw have written books almost on these decorticate preparations, and there's a surprising amount of behavior without the rat cortex. Now, when you take a cortex off early in life, the brain may rewire itself, so you can't be 100% sure that there wasn't a lot of compensatory processing, but yeah, yes.
You mentioned that there aren't a lot of oxytocin receptors in the adult cortex.
Of rats.
Of rats.
And we don't know about humans.
Okay, but the receptors that are there, where are they primarily?
Well, they
Are
aren't in.
scattered throughout?
Oh, you mean they're in the brain? There are practically none in the cortex.
So there's practically
There are more of them in the anterior, in the
Anterior.
singular cortex. We did some mice studies in the hippocampus, and we saw a very nice ring of oxytocin receptors there. There's a real problem to measure the oxytocin receptor. But this is going to change because there's this new process called clarity where you can take away all the fat and then use molecular methods. It just came out of Stanford. So I think that using molecular methods, you can then go after the receptor and answer these. We don't even know in humans. People have tried really hard to measure the human oxytocin receptor, and I don't know what the problem is, but it wouldn't work. Things that worked in rats didn't work in humans. Good questions, but needs some work. Yes?
A lot of people talk about the kind of oxytocin and vasopressin together as kind of two parts of a joint system.
Yeah, I think that way.
And you talked about vasopressin bonding to the oxytocin receptors to promote defense. Does it work the other way as well? Does oxytocin
Yes.
bond to the vasopressin
Yeah.
receptors? So,
I don't think there's any doubt about that work. Yeah.
is part of possibly the effect of these exogenous administrations of oxytocin actually suppressing vasopressin
Very
in these kind
possible.
of challenge periods?
Very possible. And it's also possible that sometimes that people don't respond in the expected way. And it's also possible that oxytocin could go to a sort of highly sensitized vasopressin receptor and give you this over-defensiveness that has been reported, especially people who've had some kind of inadequate parenting, the argument is. So Jennifer Bartz has written a very nice kind of explanation calling it context. But most of what's written about oxytocin, for some reason, it's not clear to me, you can publish a paper about oxytocin, never even mention vasopressin. And in so doing, I think they're really missing the point that oxytocin is not a single system. It's just a particularly interesting kind of center of a system. But good questions, yeah. Add one more, yes?
What's the cellular response of oxytocin signaling?
Okay, well, it's a G-coupled protein, and it has a whole cascade which has been studied. I mean, I can refer you to the papers. Vasopressin receptors are also G-coupled. And I'm not sophisticated enough, once you get below the cell, the subcellular mechanisms, to say why that's different. But in one case, at least, you're getting a lot of effects on calcium and calcium channels and calcium-based processes. And that's even true in the uterus when you're getting these constrictions. So at the most fundamental level, I think oxytocin plays a role in the use of minerals in the body, especially calcium, which is critical to survival. So, yeah, good question, though. I mean, if you're interested, I'll be happy to give you references. They're quite easy. There are quite a lot of them. They're mostly on the uterus side because they're trying to understand how to block premature labor. So they're trying to go down to the next levels and figure that one out. But so far, nobody's figured it out. And Glaxo has a oxytocin antagonist all ready to go. They've got to phase 3 trials. They're going to put it out. They're going to be a whole bunch of messed up babies because this one I'm unfortunately not so sanguine about as I am about oxytocin itself, because Karen and I did experiments years ago in which we gave a single treatment of oxytocin antagonist. It wasn't the one Glaxo's using, so maybe we'll hope theirs is better, but I doubt it. And they're going to give it to pregnant women for multiple days, not once. Women in the 26-week, 28-week of gestation. And then the babies are going to come out not quite the way they might have anyway, but who will know because they're so premature. They only buy, the old ones that are on the market buy you 2 to 8 days. They don't get you much extra time. So, and the argument is oxytocin's not, and this is probably true, not the only thing that causes labor. So blocking all these oxytocin receptors is not enough to stop the labor. There are other processes, including vasopressin. Vasopressin's been implicated in menstrual cramps and in birth. People have kind of ignored it. It may be part of the mechanism. It may cause some of the pain that goes along with birth. Oxytocin's probably more likely to be an analgesic. This is an arguable point. I was talking with Randy about this. This is, I think, going to be an important direction for looking at David Steinhorn. So we were cooking up this study for an hour ago. Good idea, huh? Because there's so many cases where pain is intractable, and it's been used now in migraines, intractable migraine headaches with success in China. It just came out a few months ago. And there are cases, I don't like drugs. I don't like the whole idea of trying to improve on nature. And I don't think we need to do that. I think we really can go after the natural mechanisms and get there a lot faster and safer. But that said, we just have to figure out how this works. We're never going to be able to sort out the story without really understanding it. Did we get our questions?
Looks like we'll give Ross the last question.
Ross wants the last question.
As a developmental psychologist, I'm fascinated with that teaser comment about epigenetic programming of
Wow.
oxytocin through early
Invite me back and we'll tell you the whole story. It's a whole story that Karen actually, we've got tissue from when Karen was in my lab, 2004, started these studies. Yeah, it looks like possibly either natural oxytocin in birth or extra oxytocin gives you more methylation, not less, more methylation. Methylation generally silences genes. So I have a model, I didn't bring it, I knew I would bore you silly with it, but it's basically my argument has been that what oxytocin is doing is that it is methylating its own receptor. I have to give you an example. As people get older, they sometimes have trouble hearing. And what people do is they talk louder, all right? I know about this. I'm experiencing all these things. Everyone is. So you don't even know it, but everyone talks louder to you because you're saying, huh, or I can't hear you, or whatever. Phil's laughing. Yeah. Well, I can still hear pretty well, but my husband has problems, so I have to yell at him sometimes. And that's because his receptors are not, and part of it is at the receptor level. It's not working too well. Well, what the body seems to do when it gets this downregulation of receptor, it actually makes more oxytocin. That's what I think is going on. It can do that up to a point, but then the receptors are like totally deaf. There's no use yelling at someone that can't hear you at all. So you just stop talking. You know, is that enough? Thank you.
On that note.
Yeah, I'll stop talking. Okay. Thank you. I've got on.